Welcome to week 4. We'll start with Fitzpatrick, chapter 7, where we explore responsible online communication. Now, despite widespread adoption, surprisingly little attention has been paid in the professional public relations literature to the many ethical issues of online communication systems. A lot of information about online communication, but very little time spent about the ethical use of online communication. Now, that was true when Fitzpatrick gave us that quote. I don't know if it's still true today, at least to the extent that it was some years ago. I think that as we learn more and more about online communication and become more adept at using online communication, the ethical use of that becomes more and more apparent, especially the importance of ethics as it relates to online communication. So a very timely topic for us this week. Now, most of the recommendations represent practical advice that ought to be followed whether you're practicing public relations offline or online. And this is the beauty of communication. I often advise leaders, or we're doing some sort of training with leaders, and part of that training is social media training. And I explain to them, as I'll describe for you, that it really doesn't matter when you talk about the basic bedrock principles of solid communication. It always starts with your audience. You have to have a clearly defined message, and that message needs to be defined or tied to a clearly understood mission. What is your goal? Why are we doing this? All those kinds of things. And we'll save more of that discussion for another day. But the good news, as I said, is that you don't need to throw out everything we know about good, practical, effective communication just because it's online versus offline. So keep that in mind. Now, there is one difference in online communication that I think it's important to discuss, and that's privacy. Some of you may be in positions where you come across what's known as personally identifiable information, or PII. In the military, in some of the commands that I've served, we did have access to personally identifiable information. That's your full name tied to a social security number or birth date or things like that. And the important thing is that if you collect it, you must protect it. Okay? If you collect it, you have to protect it. And the idea is that we prefer not to collect it at all, of course. But sometimes, depending upon your business or your organization, you're going to have to collect some information that needs to be protected, especially if you're doing online retail, for example. I mean, you have to have the person's name and credit card number, things like that, information that you have to protect. And so you need to ensure within your organization that they're doing that ethically and be prepared for some sort of breach. That happens all too often. And so as a communication advisor, what are you going to do? What recommendations do you have if that happens? All right, one of our articles this week is from Jensen called Blogola, sponsored post in the ethics of blogging. Blogola, as you'll read, refers to a term that was used for radio's payola. And there was some scandal around station playlists, where those playlists were influenced by record company payments. Okay, so the audience is thinking they're getting, this record playlist just based upon the DJ's desires, or more interestingly, what the public wants, and it's not. There are record labels who are paying for that. And so there's this big scandal. And the issue wasn't necessarily that the record labels were doing this, I don't think. It's that they did it discreetly, right? There was no transparency. And the same is true today. I have been paid to write blogs for organizations. I wrote speeches for my bosses, and still do sometimes for people. The idea is that do it in a transparent way, right? So if I were writing a blog, there's a note down there that says that I was compensated for the writing of this blog, or conversely, if I wrote a blog for an organization, but it was my personal opinion, maybe I wasn't getting paid, and it may or may not be the opinion of the organizational leaders or something like that. Again, transparency is the key. All right, Sweetser gives us an interesting article called A Losing Strategy the impact of non-disclosure in social media on relationships. Now here's the key thing from this article. A lot of academia in this very solidly researched piece, but here's the main takeaway. The study provides guidelines on how far users of social media will allow an organization to push the boundaries and take risks in this emergent media in the name of entertainment. Okay? We all know that those video clips, those pithy quotes, they get shared or go viral if they're funny or out of the norm. So how far can an organization push that boundary in order to get retweets or Facebook posts shared or things like that? How much leeway will an audience give an organization in order to do that? And the research basically investigated the role of non-disclosure and its impact on perceived relational maintenance strategies in the context of social media. And they use relational theory to do that. We don't have time to go into the details, but when you read it, you'll find that it does have some practical implications for those of us who are responsible for social media posts. Think about what an organization can do to damage rather than build a relationship with their publics. A relationship is very, very important. And then also consider unethical behavior, what Sweetser describes as a lack of disclosure that could damage the organization-public relationship. Again, it's that disclosure or transparency. Audiences are usually pretty forgiving as long as you're upfront and open and honest. It's when they feel like they've been taken advantage of that your organization has issues. And you would feel that way too. The golden rule applies in solid communication. It definitely applies in online communication as well. All right, finally we'll look at Toledano and Avidar. Their article is entitled Public Relations, Ethics, and Social Media, a cross-national study of PR practitioners. I like this approach because we get some maybe best practices for things to do or maybe some things to avoid based upon how they look at a cross-national study of PR practitioners. Major goal was to identify practitioners' current attitudes toward ethics in societies that are ranked differently on international lists, comparing levels of democracy in different countries. So some of you work for organizations that have an international footprint, and so this will be especially interesting to you. But even if you don't, there are still lessons to be learned from this article. They identify practical ethical challenges in public relations use of social media, so there's some good tips in there. And then they talk about how social media is a global tool of communication. And that's never been more true than it is today. It will go around the world in a second. And so be aware of that. Even if you are a relatively small organization, you may not have an international presence, meaning you don't have people or businesses overseas, but your tweet can certainly be read around the world. So keep that in mind. And then the use of societal factors as the political, cultural, economic levels, and media freedoms of countries. How do those differ? And how can what you post here in the United States be interpreted in another country with different norms and values? So keep that in mind. And again, that's true for any type of communication. It gets amplified when we're communicating online, especially through social media. All right. Stay ahead with your assignments, stay engaged in that discussion board, and always enjoy your time of learning.